Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and we'll get right with the business of Inquisition Update. We'll continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Global Vatican, by former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See, Francis Rooney. Yesterday, we concluded at the bottom of page 59. We're still talking about Antichrist Pope Pius IX and the Vatican Council I declaration of papal infallibility. The papal infallibility, when the papacy literally, as an act of law, ecclesiastical law, to be recognized by the civil law as well, that the papacy has one of the most unique qualities of divinity, infallibility. When he speaks ex cathedra, that is on faith and morals, and from the papal throne in Rome, from the white marble throne, the great white throne, he's to be regarded as divine and infallible. And we're talking about also two movements within the Roman Catholic Church. One might be called the extreme right and the extreme left. The extreme right being in favor of total papal control. The church, the power of the church rests in the breast of the Pope. And the Gallican movement, by contrast, the Gallican movement, you've heard me talk about it before on Inquisition Update, was a sect of the Roman Catholic Church that wholly acknowledged the Pope's spiritual power as head of the Roman Catholic Church, the supreme teacher of the church, the supreme moral authority of the church. But they wanted him to stay out of politics. Okay? The Ultramontanes were more right-wing. In other words, they wanted him to be not just the great high priest of the Roman Catholic Church. They wanted him to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Okay? Global monarchism. Global papal monarchism. That suits the Ultramontane mentality perfectly. The Gallicans, like the Ultramontanes, expected the Pope to be the spiritual father of the church, but they didn't want him meddling in their political affairs. All right. Beginning with the last two lines on page 59, the author says, the Pope's strongest supporters were adherents of the Catholic movement called Ultramontanism, an antidote to Gallicanism, which had advocated for the decentralization of ecclesiastical authority. In other words, take the power away from the Pope. Okay? Ultramontanism equated the strength of the church with the primacy and centrality of the Roman pontiff. Okay? They judged the strength of the church by the primacy and centrality of the Roman pontiff. If the Pope is weak, the church is weak. You see what they're saying? Now, many of the staunchest Ultramontanes, surprisingly, came from Protestant majority countries. Now, this stands to reason, I will add, this stands to reason, because in Protestant countries, the Pope is regarded as the Antichrist. Okay? The biblical fulfillment of the prophecies in the Bible regarding Antichrist. They fit perfectly. The papacy fulfills all the prophecies in the Bible regarding the man of sin, the little horn, the son of perdition. You've heard it over and over and over here on Inquisition Update. So, to counteract that staunch Protestant belief was the staunch Catholic belief. The Ultramontane, the extreme right wing, the Council of Trent, wing of the Roman Catholic Church, the extremely conservative, that is, the Pope is God on earth wing of the Roman Catholic Church, the Ultramontanes. So you can see the direct antagonism between Protestants in a Protestant majority country and Ultramontanism. Now, Ultramontanism, surprisingly, the most staunchest Ultramontanes came surprisingly from Protestant majority countries. Cardinal Manning, Archbishop of Westminster, remember England was Protestant by necessity. If nothing else, Rome tried to destroy the Protestant crown, many times attacking England, trying to overthrow the Protestant government. And Roman Catholicism, for quite reasonable reasons, was suppressed. Catholicism was suppressed in England. Now it says Cardinal Manning, Archbishop of Westminster, was among the church's firmest believers in, quote, the beauty of inflexibility, unquote. In other words, he was an Ultramontane. When the Pope is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, all issues are settled by the Pope, okay? And so this he regarded as the beauty of inflexibility. In other words, in the Protestant world, there's room for debate, okay? The wishes and whims of the people dictate. But in Ultramontanism, the papacy dictates. Okay, one source. All right. Cardinal Manning, Archbishop of Westminster, in a Protestant country, an Ultramontane, was among the church's firmest believers in, quote, the beauty of inflexibility, as he so memorably put it, that derived from papal absolutism. Okay? Ultramontanism equals papal absolutism. Of course, Ultramontanism was not just a theological or rhetorical position in the context of 1869. It was also a political strategy. Okay? A political strategy. Ultramontanism is a political strategy. The idea that the Supreme Pontiff should rule the world is a political strategy. A right-wing, ultramontane, Roman Catholic strategy to make the Pope the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And they won't stop or they cease to be ultramontanes. How many ultramontanes do you suppose are in Washington, D.C., passing laws that, without our knowledge, conform us to Roman Catholic canon law and make us, wittingly or unwittingly, with or without our consent, to make us subjects of the Roman Pontiff? Now, if you're Protestants, I can go one step further and say that it is making us subjects of the Antichrist of the Bible. Is that going a bridge too far, as many people accuse me? Is that a bridge too far? The beauty of inflexibility. Ultramontanism is derived from the view of papal absolutism. And absolutism, papal absolutism, is a political strategy. Remember, I've said before, the Roman Catholic Church doesn't proselytize by sending priests and nuns and Roman Catholics door to door like the Jehovah's Witnesses, trying to convince you that you should be Catholic. No, that never works. Too much Protestantism in the country. What little there is today, many people just obviously understand from common sense that men don't confess their sins to men. We confess them to God. Men who have a right understanding, a biblical understanding of Christ, and the creation and the Creator, well, don't bow down and worship images and idols, man-made images and idols. Common sense still dictates. There's still inherent in some of us we can't go there. Confess our sins to priests and seek absolution from a priest? Likely a pedophile to boot? No. And bowing down and worshiping images and idols? No. It just runs counter to the marrow of our bones. So, they take their political strategy and write all the laws for the land. And those result in higher taxes and then benefits from the government. I mean, surely you'd vote to pass one of these laws that make us subject of the Roman Pontiff if there's a carrot at the end of the stick. In other words, we're going to give you free health care. We're going to give you insurance, Social Security. We're going to give you, well, everything. But it's going to cost you more than everything. Okay? It's going to cost you your eternal soul. What does the Bible say? Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Do you know how many people are listening to Inquisition Update and understand what I'm saying and wish they could be part of spreading this gospel? That the papacy is the Antichrist and that we're all being made slaves to the Pope by our government? Do you know how many of those people would love to participate in educating people about this but simply can't because they're on Social Security? And what this really amounts to, if you're doing the math, is that it's a rebellion against the government. If the government is the servant of the papacy, then the government's the problem. The government is the problem. The government is the one who has enslaved us to a Roman Catholic system. Why, if I'm heard publicly speaking out against the government, well, then I become a target of the government, and they can take away my Social Security and all my other benefits. So I think I'll just let Inquisition Update do it. Is that how you want to be viewed from heaven? Just let Inquisition Update do it? Look, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. I've been lied to all my life. I've been lied to. I've been led to believe that our government is a Christian government and that I must obey it without question. I must obey the higher power because he's a servant of God. But then late in my life I found out he's not the servant of God, nor is he Christian. My government is papist. And to educate a world about this is more than Inquisition Update is capable of. We owe our allegiance to Christ and Him only. Our citizenship is not of this world, it is of the heavenlies. We have a king We have a constitution, and we have a moral obligation to free God's people from the papal Pharaoh and all the kings of the earth who do his bidding. I'm tired of living my life to support a tyrant, an antichrist tyrant, and a usurper of Christ's heavenly throne. I'm tired of being lied to and used as a slave, a resource for a diabolical system. And I'm coming to terms. It's decision day for Inquisition Update. All right. He says, of course, ultramontanism was not just a theological or rhetorical position in the context of 1869. It was also a political strategy. What the loss of the papal domains might subtract in the Pope's temporal power, infallibility would add to his moral authority. His moral authority. Do you know what moral authority means in Roman Catholic canon law? Temporal power. The end game of the moral authority of the papacy is to govern over the kings of the earth, to get all the governments of the earth to recognize the papacy's moral authority, the supreme moral authority in the world. Isn't that what Mikhail Gorbachev said to Raisa when they went to visit the Pope? Oh, you didn't know about that? Yes, indeed. Mikhail Gorbachev and his wife Raisa, wearing black and veils, went to the Vatican, and Gorbachev introduced the Pope to his wife as the greatest moral authority on earth. Now you know why the Berlin Wall fell and communism was destroyed. Okay? All right. Just as the council had commenced, we're talking about Vatican Council I. Just as the council had commenced with inclement weather in December of 1869, so it climaxed 6 months later on the morning of July 18th, 1870. Sheets of rain ripped across St. Peter's Square. Bolts of lightning ruptured the dark sky over the basilica as thunder rattled the windows. Inside, the bishops gathered under flickering candles to cast their votes on infallibility. The motion passed by an overwhelming majority, its opponents having either come around to support it or, in some cases, and in many cases, I will add, stayed away to avoid casting a ballot. Just 2 bishops voted against it. One of these was an American, Edward Fitzgerald of Little Rock, Arkansas, one of the most Catholic states in the Union. And it says immediately after the vote, Fitzgerald fell on his knees and declared his consent to the Pope. And you know that day will rest in eternal grief for Fitzgerald. Fell on his knees and declared his consent to the Antichrist. The Pope was now doctrinally infallible, but he was not invulnerable. This was demonstrated the very next day, July 19th, 1870, when France declared war on Roman Catholic Prussia. Okay? The culmination of long simmering hostilities, the Franco-Prussian War marked the beginning of the end of the Pope's temporal power. The French garrison that had been protecting the Pope from King Victor Emmanuel's army was withdrawn from Rome to join the fight against Prussia, leaving the city, Rome, undefended but for the small force of the Zouaves. Victor Emmanuel massed his troops and waited to see how the French fared. The answer came soon. On September 2nd, Napoleon III was overwhelmed by the Prussians and was captured with his army. The king ordered his troops to move on Rome. Even Pope Pius IX accepted now that Rome was lost, but he remained unbowed. He would not give up the city without a fight. Quote, listen to these pompous words. Listen. If the Lord wants me to lose the Papal States, he explained, then let him take them away. I cannot hand them over. Unquote. These sound like the words of the Vicar of Christ to you? Because he did not want bloodshed to delay a fait accompli, he ordered the Zouaves to make only a show of resistance, enough to indicate the Pope's defiance, but no more. The attack began at 5:30 a.m. on September 20th, 1870, when Italian forces began pounding the ancient Aurelian walls with artillery. At 7 a.m., diplomats from Austria and France and elsewhere began arriving at the Vatican in carriages to receive the Pope's formal protest and witness history in the making. Pius IX said Mass in his private chapel. Lost in prayer, he barely noticed the thuds of distant cannon fire. Italian troops entered the city through the breach in the walls near the Porta Pia in mid-morning. A white flag rose to the top of Castle St. Angelo. Another appeared fluttering over the cupola at St. Peter's. More than 1,100 years after the donation of Pepin, remember Pepin donated to the papacy the so-called patrimony of Peter, the Papal States, to make the Pope a temporal king and to also help support financially the Pope, setting a global precedent, I will add. It says more than 1,100 years after the donation of Pepin, the Church was stripped of its last earthly domain. Rome was lost. The temporal role of the Holy See came to an end. And let me add the words, or so it seemed. The mortal wound is healed. It appears in 1870 that the Pope has been relegated to just the head of the Roman Catholic Church. But his moral authority grew by leaps and bounds at the very time when it appeared that he was no longer a king on earth and could not command kings on earth. So the whole world believes the papacy's toast. But the Jesuits have other things in mind. All right, part 2 of this chapter goes this way. The world's reaction to the Pope's temporal downfall was mixed. In the United States, newspapers registered conflicting feelings. Remember, this is the United States, when just 100 years earlier, it was almost totally Protestant. Protestants believed the papacy is the Antichrist. Now, in 1870, well, there's mixed feelings about the Pope losing his temporal power. See what Rome can do in just 100 years? There's mixed feelings. Here's one of them, quote, "The great scandal of the ages is wiped out," unquote, exulted one New Hampshire journal, quote, "and the deeds of violence, blood, and shame enacted by an ecclesiastical prince, that is the Pope, the Antichrist, are to be known no more except in history," unquote. Wonderful words, huh? Wish they were true. We'll be back right after these messages. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com worldwide. Freedom is never free. We need your support today at FirstAmendmentRadio.com.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Introducing the most efficient gravity filter available. You know, if you were to throw 100 ball bearings at a magnet, most would bounce off. But if you placed them on the magnet, all would stick. The same principle applies in water filtration. Most filtration systems force water through the filter at 60 to 90 psi, causing water molecules to race through the filter in less than a second. The Berkey Light is different. Water molecules take minutes to pass through the tortuous path of the self-sterilizing filters. This allows the proprietary media formulation to remove and reduce pathogenic bacteria, cysts, chemicals, herbicides, pesticides, organic solvents, foul tastes, odors, heavy metals, and nitrates. It is so powerful it purifies raw, untreated water from remote lakes, streams, and stagnant ponds.
Get the advanced Berkey Light Purifier by calling First Amendment Radio at 559-781-3773 or order on the web at FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Not yet available in Iowa.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to hear Inquisition Update continue on First Amendment Radio, please support the network. First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Look, some people in the United States got it. This one New Hampshire journal got it. It said, the great scandal of the ages, the papacy. The great scandal of the ages. The Antichrist. The scandal is that he has been relegated to Christ's throne on the earth. That is the great scandal. And he says the great scandal of the ages is wiped out. He said further, and the deeds of violence. Shall I recapture for you the deeds of violence in a breath? I'm sorry, it's not possible. The deeds of violence, blood, and shame that have been perpetrated by this ecclesiastical prince known as the papacy are legion. They are legion. It would take libraries to capture all of the violence, the blood, and the shame of that human institution known as the Vicar of Christ. He calls him an ecclesiastical prince. And he declares that these deeds of blood and violence and shame shall be known no more in the world except in history. It's a history that you've probably never even heard about until you stumbled upon Inquisition Update. See how marvelously the papacy hides its history? Of course, you have to hide all this hideous history in order to foist upon the world the idea that the Pope is a harbinger of peace and liberty, the great moral authority in the world. Nothing could be further from the truth, and yet the vast majority of the world believes it. Or if they don't know anything about it. Now, it said other papers, remember the feelings were mixed in the United States. Other papers carried reports of anguished Catholics congregating to protest the quote-unquote spoliation of the Pope's domain, including a monster demonstration in Philadelphia and a march of 5,000 in Covington, Kentucky, to condemn the quote-unquote usurpation. That's right, stripping the Pope of his temporal domains, merely stripping him of the papal states, was a gigantic usurpation. No one ever stopped to consider that the papacy itself is a usurpation of Christ's throne, the throne of the Creator. It's just listen to the totality of the blindness. Roman Catholics all over the country who are supposed to be Americans and promote religious liberty, Roman Catholics all over the country were pooling their resources, signing up as volunteers to go help the Pope maintain the papal states. They were going to fight the French revolutionists to restore to the Pope his temporal kingdom. If Roman Catholics in America were truly believing in religious liberty, why wouldn't they appreciate religious liberty coming to France? I mean, John Carroll had sense enough to tell the Pope, if we are going to survive, if the Roman Catholic Church is going to survive, to thrive, and eventually control this country, then you, Mr. Pope, have to stay out. You have to stand down. Let us build this Roman Catholic Church in America, because the Protestants in America overwhelmingly outnumber us, and if there's one word coming from Rome to dictate to Roman Catholics in this country what they shall do and believe and on and on and on, they'll wipe us out. So now, just 100 years later, Roman Catholics all over the country, most of them who had immigrated from Germany and Ireland, were demanding that the Pope be restored his temporal crown. Many of them were ultramontanes that believed deep down in their heart that the Pope should rule America too. You see how divided we were? Maybe those Protestants were right. The greatest of evils to be feared in any land is Roman Catholicism, is popery. Maybe they were right. Indeed, they were more than right. They were biblical. They were biblical. They understood who the Antichrist was. The greatest of evils to be feared in the world is the Antichrist. The one who betrays Christ with a kiss, pretends to be the voice of Christ, and then lead all of God's people into sin and idolatry, pope worship. Idolatry is pope worship. Obedience to a man, in contradistinction to Christ, is pope worship. Adherence to Roman Catholic canon law, willingly or unwillingly, is pope worship. You cannot serve two masters, because you will love the one and despise the other. And guess what? It's far more expedient in this world, in this earthly, physical world, to worship a physical God. Especially when he has the power of the state against you and has used it with precision for nearly 1,800 years on the earth. But not everybody bent the knee to the papal Baal. They'd rather burn at the stake. They'd rather rot in a dungeon. They'd rather die of starvation with praises of Christ on their lips and curses for Antichrist than to bend their knee to the papal Baal. They went against their own governments, who served the papacy and not Christ. Their breath still reverberates in the history of this world. They still reverberate around the throne of Almighty God. How long, O Lord, wilt thou not bring justice and judgment to this world? How long must our souls linger as bloodthirsty tyrants add to our ranks every year? The prayers of the saints, prayers of the saints ascendeth up to heaven forever and ever. Are we going to bend the knee to Baal? Or are we going to go the way of the saints? That's what it boils down to. He says, not all Catholics were sorry to see the Pope's temporal power come to an end. That's right. Do you know something? The most successful rebellion in the world against the papacy were from Roman Catholics. That's right. They kicked the Jesuits out of every country that they were ever in. Roman Catholics did, not Protestants. Why don't the Catholics of this country kick the Jesuits out? Why don't the Catholics of today, like the John Carroll of yesterday, insist the papacy butt out? You know, while the Protestants are digging and scratching, trying to find their way back to Rome, some of the Catholics in this country are getting fed up with Vatican bank scandals, with pedophile priest scandals, with the assassination of popes, with government, with Vatican meddling in government and politics. They're fed up. You know what? They're more Protestant than the ecumenical evangelibellies who signed their life away, who renounced their birthright at Vatican Council II. They're more Protestant than they are. Those Catholics. I've worn out the term. It's a hideous reality. Sometimes I think I'd be better off talking to Roman Catholics who are just fed up with the Roman Catholic Church and the priests and the popes and the scandals. Sometimes I make more sense to Roman Catholics than I do to those who call themselves Protestants. Not all Catholics were sorry to see the Pope's temporal power end. Many viewed the loss of Rome as a blessing in disguise, believing in the words of the New York Times, quote, that the Pope, as head of the quote-unquote Christian world, would be much more powerful than in his capacity as the sovereign of Rome, unquote. You see what's happening? They stripped the Pope of his temporal domains to increase his moral power, his spiritual power. It was a strategy to increase the power of the Pope. The New York Times said that the Pope, as head of the Christian world, if the Antichrist become the head of the Christian world, that would be much more powerful than the capacity as a sovereign of Rome. An editorial in the Times put it this way, quote, Pope Pius IX, as simple head of the Catholic Church, will be a greater man than he who combined that office with the kingship of a small, badly governed, and disaffected territory, unquote. Can you feel the higher and higher and higher and higher hopes for the papacy now that the temporal power has been lost? That the papacy would become a much, much, much more stronger moral authority in the world. And through that moral authority, he could regain even more than he lost. And with the help of the United States, it's a done deal. You see what happens when you make your bed with Antichrist? You make your bed with the whore of Rome? You come down with a spiritual venereal disease. An incurable spiritual venereal disease. That's what happened to America. That's the fall of America. Shall I remain an American citizen when I know what I know about this government and the papacy and what the Bible says about it? Let me ask you a question. If the papacy truly did surrender its temporal power, its kingly power, its power in the civil government, his power to rule over the kings of the earth, why didn't they remove the silver key from the papal flag? Why did they not unleash the scarlet or golden cord, as the case may be, that binds that silver key to the golden key on the papal flag? Why does the papal flag still have two keys on it, bound together with a scarlet-colored cord? The meaning of which is, only by the shedding of blood will these keys, the gold representing my spiritual power, the silver representing my temporal power, only by the shedding of blood, as signified by this scarlet cord, only the untying of that scarlet cord and the resulting bloodshed can these two keys be separated. That's the meaning of the papal flag. See, every flag has meaning inherent in the imagery on the flag. And nowhere is it more demonstrable than the papal flag. The Pope's papal tiara, which represents his authority over heaven, his authority over the earth, and his authority over the gates of hell. That's what they represent. Why is that still on the papal flag? The papacy only appeared to be destroyed. It lulled the Protestant world to sleep at the very time that they were selling futurism in all the churches. The papacy's not the Antichrist. It's somebody in the future. You see the combined strategy and the effectiveness of it? You know what the results was? Vatican Council II. Surrender. Complete and total surrender to the papacy. That's what it was. Spiritual treason against the throne of Almighty God. Exchange Antichrist for Christ. That's what they did. Accepted the papacy as the supreme moral authority in the world, the one man in whom all the Christian world could be united. Doesn't that belong to Jesus? You see the error of Vatican Council II? You see how it came about? And do you know our government helped it? Do you see now what the loss of the temporal power, the supposed loss of the temporal power of the Pope did, increasing his moral authority in the world? Protestantism was defeated at the very time when it appeared that the papacy was no longer a viable institution in the world. Pope Pius IX, as simple head of the Catholic Church, will be a greater man than he who combined that office with the kingship of a small, badly governed, and disaffected territory. Unquote. This line of reasoning was not new, says the author, as F.R., that is Father, God forgive me, as Father Robert Graham, S.J., Jesuit priest, points out in his book on Vatican diplomacy. It had been entertained for decades. It had been entertained decades earlier by no less a church authority than Cardinal Bartolomeo Pacca, one of the heroes of the Holy See in its struggles against Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon tried to separate the Papal States from Pope Pius VII, Cardinal Pacca urged the papacy not to stand firm against the emperor's demands. Pacca was captured and thrown into prison by Napoleon's forces in 1809. He had plenty of time to reflect during the 4 years of his incarceration. Among his epiphanies, yes, epiphanies are real popular among Roman Catholics, direct revelation. They don't get anything from the Bible. They get epiphanies. One of his epiphanies was that the loss of the Papal States might not be all bad. Quote, "For one thing," writes Graham, paraphrasing Pacca, "the end of the Papal States would end or weaken the blind jealousy or antipathy which existed in so many places against the clergy," that's the Roman Catholic clergy, "and the court of Rome," that's the Holy See. The sovereign pontiffs, freed of their heavy burden of temporal affairs, could devote all their time henceforth to the spiritual good of their flock. Unquote. History has shown that Pacca was right. Popes gained much more than they lost. Let me read it again. Popes gained much more than they lost with the end of the temporal sovereignty. To quote a more recent scholar, George Weigel, quote, "It would take a particular kind of obtuseness combined with an over-the-top romanticism to think that the loss of the Papal States was anything other than a tremendous blessing for the Catholic Church," unquote. Does this mean that Pope Pius IX's efforts to keep the Papal States were not only in vain, but counterproductive? Listen to what the author replies. Maybe not. Maybe not. Pius's defiance, doomed as it may have been, established an extraordinarily important precedent. The Pope and the Church would yield to no earthly power. I got news for you. The Pope and the Church yield to no heavenly power either. It's as though it was not ultimately useful to the Church's spiritual mission for the Pope to rule over a large temporal domain. It would have been far worse for him to submit to the sovereign rule of another temporal power. Had Pope Pius IX caved to King Victor Emmanuel, or to take another example, had Pope Pius VII caved to Napoleon Bonaparte, the Pope would have admitted dependence on a foreign potentate. You know, just like the United States depends on a foreign potentate, the papacy, the Pope would have admitted dependence on a foreign potentate, and the church would have suffered an irreparable abridgment of its independence, neutrality, and ultimately its inherent sovereignty. Since the church, that is the Roman Catholic Church, is meant to be international and universal, says the popes, to serve God and all mankind, gag me with a spoon, not the whims of a particular king, president, or premier. It must operate as its own sovereign and independent power. Here again, says Father Graham, who understood and wrote about the political status of the Catholic Church with great insight, said this, quote, "The supreme head of the Roman Catholic Church recognizes no territorial boundaries in the scope of his mission, and his religious role is liable to be suspect to any given portion of his flock by being himself the political subject of any one prince." In other words, if the Pope is ever subject to any earthly prince, the entire Roman Catholic Church is subject to that prince, and the Pope's power is history. All right? That's why the Pope will never take anything from a civil power. He says, in order to be free in his religious work, he had also to be politically free. It was necessary that the whole world should have means of knowing that the head of Roman Catholicism was free. It was not enough for him to be free. He also had to be seen to be free. Roman Catholic canon law stipulates that the Pope is the judge of every man, and no man may judge him. Pope Pius IX wouldn't take anything from Napoleon, and he wouldn't take anything from Victor Emmanuel, because he is supreme and sovereign, and he is not dependent on any earthly power. He is the power that empowers all earthly powers. All powers are vested in the breast of the papacy, and no king of this earth can exercise power lawfully without the subjection to the papacy. That's Roman Catholic canon law. Now, despite Pope Pius IX's excommunication of the king, Victor Emmanuel II considered himself a pious Catholic, and he was determined to be respectful to the Pope, and as he could be under the circumstances. He did not boast about conquering Rome, nor did he rush in to personally claim it. He waited almost a year until July of 1871 to enter the city and declare Rome the capital of Italy. See, they're still tiptoeing. Still tiptoeing with respect. Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. Except the pages of history. Antichrist dies hard. And there's something really hard coming. It's called that rock that was carved out of the mountain without hands. It will strike that image in the feet, grind it to powder, and it will blow away with the wind. God hasten the day. We'll see you tomorrow on Inquisition Update.